Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Quantum Nurse Freedom International live stream, where we attempt to explore the truths that mainstream wouldn't touch. Sometimes even alternative media wouldn't touch. So today, I'm really honored that I have Vanessa Vili, who's a veteran investigative journalist and geopolitical analyst. And she has really been covering Syria from the ground for over a decade. And just recently, she successfully escaped whatever, she could have been not with us anymore, but she was able to escape from Syria. And now she lives in Lebanon. And, Lebanon is also really challenged state or country, but nevertheless, she can't be too far away from Syria, I guess, for now. Okay. So since that's her special coverage all throughout over past decade. And of course, I'm always very happy when another esteemed guest of ours, repeat guest like Alex Krainer, is eagerly or can come and join us. Because for me, it's a matter of bringing strong voices together in a platform where they can discuss situation. There may be differences, but still it's good for my audience, for myself, for my own being, for my own sanity and health, that I continue to have this conversation and connect with these friends from a distance. And I'm glad that Hartmut can continue to join us too, because his situation in Germany is not convenient, or it's another crazy situation. Sometimes I run out of these English words that they all use to be powerful in their conversation. But nevertheless, here we are. So we will be, although the topic is unmasking Syria's war, truth, propaganda, and power games, but we are aware that, you know, Syria is Syria has attracted so many of these geopolitical superpowers, and it could be so confusing. Now, just before we started, and I think other people would like to know also, first, Vanessa, how you've been, because it's, and I'm glad you mentioned about your two dogs, but how about your two dogs? What about the other dogs that you've left in Syria? So people care about animals as well.
Well, the other dogs are fine. I just got sent a video by one of the adopters, so they're good. And I managed to get another one out, as I mentioned, after I left with one. No, I mean, everything is good. People, I think when we're talking about geopolitics, we tend to forget the human aspect. And people in the region are still very traumatized. They're very broken here in Lebanon after the assassination of Sayed Hassan Nasrallah, who was not only a leader, he was a father to most people here who are part of the resistance. And of course, the resistance, for people to understand, it isn't only Shia Muslim Hezbollah. Hezbollah has within its resistance access Christians and Sunni Muslims and all people that stand against Israel here in Lebanon. It has huge support in Lebanon from all sectors of society. Yeah, it has also many detractors, of course, many of which who are very much funded and backed by the US and by Israel. But I think, people are still very much in recovery after what happened since October the 7th to the region in its entirety, really. So I think we're still dealing with the processing of the fall of Syria back in December. It wasn't really that long ago. And, many of us went to the funeral of Sayed Hassan Nasrallah, which was overflown by Zionist jets, who we were told afterwards were intending to bomb the ceremony, but who were actually threatened by Yemen and Iran, that if they did, there would be immediate repercussions. So they backed off. It was a very emotional time. And as I said, I think people are still going through the mourning process for everything that's happened, really, since October the 7th and prior to that, because this is one long, successive genocide, really, and crusader movement against the region that has never, ever really given up.
Thank you for that update, Vanessa. What I would like to see in this episode is like just kind of like make all the guests whom I have now to really just have that round table. So whenever Alex, Drago, and Hartmut, feel free to just chime in, and with Vanessa in the midst of this conversation. Gonna gang up on Vanessa for all good reasons. Okay, so but see, and the whole world knew that not too long ago, West Asia was and Trump was in the center of all this conversation. So my question would be, how would you describe the motivations between U.S., Russia, Iran, Turkey, Israel, and perhaps I say Germany because and
How long have you got?
Serbia, whatever you give to us, it will be the best. So I take whatever you, Vanessa, can have, and Alex and Drago. So it's like, what does it have anything to do with Syria? Its involvement, because I think like not just me, but many people would like to see Syria in regain its sovereignty. And if I can see it in my lifetime, that will be awesome. That would be awesome. So please continue.
Yeah, we hope so. I mean, I think it's going to be a long time before Syria is fully back on its feet in any way, shape, or form as it was before. I think what you're seeing now in Syria is the maneuvering of, as you said, all of the powers that were both involved in defending Syria, but also those that were involved in the final overthrow of the Syrian government and the Syrian people, because I don't really divide the two. It was the Syrian people that fought for its own sovereignty and for its existence as a secular, inclusive state. For 14 years, the Syrian Arab Army was the Syrian people. I really have to stress that they didn't surrender. There was surrender, but it was orchestrated. And actually, the Syrian Arab Army was left with absolutely no option but to surrender. We can go into more detail on that, but they were betrayed at a very high level, both internally and externally, from the information that I gleaned from being on the ground during the last days. And also since I've left Syria and I've had the opportunity to speak to former military, former national defense forces, former, let's say, people who were close to the inner circle of power and so on. So the picture has become a lot clearer for me. And I think, the entire story that the Syrian army surrendered is for me something, I do kind of take it personally, because I was on the ground in Syria from 2016 onwards, and I witnessed how the Syrian Arab Army soldiers who were on salaries of around $20 to $40, who every time I photographed them, it broke my heart when I saw them wearing trainers and slippers while they were fighting, while they were wearing mismatched uniforms that they had to go to the market and buy themselves, while ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Ara al-Sham and all of the derivatives from Al-Qaeda that were being funded by the US, UK, Israeli, Gulf state, Turkish alliance were there with the most state-of-the-art equipment, uniforms, as we saw actually from the photographs of the early days of the attack on Aleppo, and even prior to that of Ukrainian forces training Jolani's militia in Idlib prior to the attack on Aleppo in November 2024. And the fact that those soldiers who were conscripts from all walks of life in Syria, so they came from Sunni Muslim communities. In fact, they were dominated by Sunni Muslim, both in the command structure in Syria of the intelligence, the security, the military, the government were absolutely almost 95% Sunni Muslim. So this entire kind of canard that this was a freedom movement against Alawite dominance in Syria is absolutely insane, which of course is now justifying the ethnic cleansing pogroms against the Alawite communities, particularly on the coast, but also in central Syria, in Homs, and on the border with Lebanon. And I think what we're seeing now is the maneuvering by all of those players. China is probably the most quiet of all of them over Syria. Russia is definitely maneuvering to consolidate its base on the coast because I was talking to a couple of ambassadors today who were formerly in Syria, who were talking to me, having had discussions with the former Russian ambassador. The importance of that base is the connection to Africa and to Libya, of course. For Russia, and the fact that that base is effectively their only footprint really in the West Asia region. Russia also had the exclusive exploration rights for the Syrian gas reserves off that coastal area of Syria. They were given those in 2013, but they never went ahead and explored those gas reserves. So I think for Russia, it's been a difficult time for them to achieve what they want to do, which is that consolidation and that remaining on the coast. I do believe they've been in negotiations with Israel. Israel has been lobbying the US to allow Russia to stay, because for both Russia and Israel, the important thing is to prevent Erdogan's expansionism. And so we have actually seen Israel and Russia working in tandem to some degree. We've seen Israel bombing the Turkish proxies that have been leading drone attacks, for example, against Haimamin base. And for both of them, as I said, they want to prevent Erdogan's neo-Ottoman ambitions in Syria. And we saw that very clearly when, for example, Erdogan had been discussing with Jolani that he would establish air defense and military bases in central Syria, in Palmyra, in T4, in Hama, which is to the south of Idlib, relatively close to Latakia and Tartus, to the coastal regions, and almost immediately Israel bombed them. I think that was one of the most intense bombing raids since the fall of Damascus, when, of course, Israel effectively decimated Syria's military, naval, air capability completely in the 48 hours. I think it carried out something like 700 strikes. But more recently, it carried out, I think it was between 25 and 30 strikes in one night on those centers that had been earmarked by Turkey for establishing air defense and establishing military presence in central Syria, which of course would then impinge on Israel's agenda of creating the David Corridor, which would run from the south up the eastern flank of Syria, entering Iraq and going as far as the Euphrates. And that's why for Israel it's important for them to maintain the Kurdish factions in the northeast, because they've always supported Kurdish separatist movements for that reason, because they know that it's a forward settler movement for them and it will enable them to expand to the extent that they want to. At the same time, I've just written about the fact that the British are back in force, having seen the collapse of the Sykes-Picot Treaty, which was signed between the French and the British in 1916 to carve up the region and extend French and British spheres of influence in the region. That had largely been broken and was disappearing because of the unity of the resistance axis. But now we're actually seeing the British back in force, both intelligence and military, and private military contractors, British run, are now back in Syria, talking about cooperation with Al-Qaeda on military and defense, which of course works in favor of Israel, because that means that they can contain the Takfiri project within British control mechanisms. But what's also interesting, because I would say the animosity between Britain and Russia is far greater than between the US and Russia. We've seen an uptick in the actual seriousness of attacks on the Russian base since the British have been back in Damascus in force. Turkey is in the midst of negotiations with Israel, but it's very clear that it's sort of received the message loud and clear from Israel. It hasn't extended its reach any further from the northern sectors, mostly Aleppo, and then a stretch across central northern Syria, which it wants to keep to prevent the unification of Kurdish factions in the northwest with the Kurdish factions in the northeast. Israel, of course, has expanded into southern Syria, and it's currently trying to weaponize the Druze animosity towards Al-Qaeda to enable it to secure its foothold in the south prior to it extending to the David corridor up the eastern flank, which of course at the moment is occupied basically by the US and US proxies. This gets terribly complicated, by the US and US proxies, which are effectively the former Free Syrian Army and ISIS, who are also operating in the northeast and the eastern areas and have taken territory approaching Damascus from the east. I think I'll stop there because I'm sure there's questions.
Alex?
Yes.
No, I know you've been busy taking notes. So do you want to share any of your notes for Vanessa?
Well, I had like 10 billion questions, and thank you, Vanessa. This is extremely interesting. But so Syrian Arab army never really surrendered. They were betrayed. But my understanding is that some of their best units remained intact, and that they went kind of underground into hiding in the region around Latakia, and that a part of them crossed into Iraq with a whole division, like a whole tank division, right? That's correct, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I've seen that there's been some attacks, whether by just ordinary Syrian resistance, ordinary people self-organizing, or whether there's more to it, where they've been kind of here and there eliminating these jihadis around Syria, correct?
Go on with the questions, and I'll kind of fill in if that's okay. Unless
well, okay. So my question is ultimately, is like a resistance consolidating, and do you think that they might be waiting for an opportune time to mount a stronger attack?
I mean, you are correct. There's around between 80,000 to 100,000 Syrian Arab army who managed to get out. And they're not only in Iraq, they are basically now trained, equipped, and ready for whatever operations the resistance axis decides are the most effective. I also know the factions that you're talking about, I would say, are not perhaps as multiple or as strong resistance factions as some people are describing them, particularly on the coastal areas. But I do know that there is potential for a much bigger force on the coast, but the problem is having political backing for that resistance. because, as you can imagine, Syria now is a boiling pot of international interests. And if any faction, say for example the Alawites, if the Alawites were to arm themselves and form a resistance faction without some kind of political backing, whether it's from Russia, whether it's from another country, to support them as a political movement, it's very hard for them right now to actually launch any serious attack, because they're going to come up against the US, Israel, the British, and so on. So ultimately, what really has to happen, and that's from conversations that I've had here and with Syrians outside and inside, there has to be some kind of official political movement for these armed forces to unify behind, for it to be effective. Like, you'll notice that Hezbollah has been quiet. Iraqi resistance factions have been very quiet, except with dealing with the ISIS threat on the border between Syria and Iraq. If it encroaches on their own territory, I mean, we've had clashes here in the Bekaa, for example, on the eastern borders of Lebanon, the western borders of Syria, between HTS and the tribal factions, because HTS has tried to invade Lebanese territory and to basically take territory and take homes there, which is effectively what they're doing throughout Syria. They're ethnically cleansing, and they're leading a Takfiri settler project very similar to the Zionist settler project in Palestine right now. So I think for there to be, there will still be pockets of resistance, yes. But for there to be an actual serious resistance movement, there has to first be, this is not necessarily my opinion, I do agree with it, but this is an opinion from people in the region. There has to be a serious political movement behind which they can move, let's say. And at the moment, that is in its very early stages, but it's relatively baby stages at the moment. Yeah. Because what we also have to understand is that people who may have the ability to lead that kind of movement may have got out of Syria, but they still have family in Syria, in the areas that are now under attack and so on. So it's extremely difficult for people that are outside to speak out and actually take a stand, because their families are going to be immediately targeted by HTS. I think when HTS comes under some kind of control, and I do think that's going to happen, we can talk about how that's going to happen. I'm not even sure Jolani's going to stay, because the number of his enemies is increasing on a daily basis, because he's abandoned the Takfiri project that he promised all of them. Trump is putting pressure on him to get rid of the foreign mercenaries. Well, if he does that, he loses 40% of his fighting force and those that support him. And he's already promised them for fighting in November and December last year. He's promised them settlement in Syria, citizenship, positions of power in the government, in the army, and so on. He's between a rock and a very hard place at the moment. And I think the pressure on him is increasing exponentially. So until HTS sort of comes under control, if I look at it, I think what the British in particular will try to do, and the US will support it, they'll try to bring in a political figure from outside, right? Someone that's been groomed in the US or even in the UK, a Syrian politician or businessman that's well embedded in US establishment or UK establishment, who will come in as a kind of figurehead leader. Jolani might initially be sidelined. And the British at the moment seem to be taking control of the military.
I know the man, Juan Al-Guaido, is available. And, you know, since they don't have problem growing beers, shaving beers, changing names, they could just give him an Arab name and he's right there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Vanessa, on a serious note, when you say the Brits are in Damascus, are you talking about MI6 or SAS or
no, all of them?
All of them.
Every single one of them. There's
mercenaries,
private
everything.
military. Yeah. There's private military contractors who moved in even before December. There's now, I mean, a friend of mine who's in Damascus said to me, Vanessa, like every single 4-star hotel is jam-packed full of Brits right now. And that's quite interesting, because immediately after the coup, the hotels were full of so-called Takfiris, but all of them had American passports. All of them were registering under American passports. Now it's wall-to-wall British now. And
I don't
that
understand how that happens. I genuinely don't understand how that happens, because the same thing happened in Ukraine. The same thing happened in Bosnia. You know, the United States or whoever goes in, they clean up, and all of a sudden the place is overrun by MI6 and SAS and their various contractors, and everybody's reporting it's crawling with British here in Sarajevo. Everybody's saying the Brits are the dominant force. Before the war in Ukraine started, Kiev was overrun by the Brits, not Damascus. Like, how do they
Gaziantep in Turkey is MI6 central.
Really?
On the border, right on the border with Syria from the beginning. And I think we talked about this, Alex, and you came up with that brilliant analogy of the Mad Max giant with the dwarf on his shoulder controlling.
Master Blaster.
You know, and
Blaster,
and that's what the Brits do. This is an intelligence operation against Syria that was begun by the Brits back in, post 9/11 between Bush and Blair. I just wrote about this. And it's the British intelligence that has run this war. The Americans, I tend to see them as the muscle, the financing and the muscle and the brawn and the kind of the heavyweight support. But the Brits are the ones behind the scenes running it all. And that makes sense for me. The Americans go in first to kind of clear the way, and then the Brits come in to clean up and basically embed themselves. Take over the military, take over, it's the same, like you said, in Kosovo, it was the Brits that were doing most of the cleanup operation there, including the guy who created the white helmets in Syria. So the connection, again, is always there.
Everywhere. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
And even, before he became head of the MI6, Sir Richard Moore was ambassador in Ankara. Yeah, and he was BFFs with Erdogan.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but the Brits, as I said, all the intelligence operations against Syria were being pretty much masterminded out of Gaziantep. That's where the White Helmet headquarters were. That's where they were being trained. That's where all of the kind of citizen journalists, the media outlets gathered, including ISIS, by the way, when it was known as, the Jihadi Express. Because all of the Takfiris passed through Gaziantep before they came into Syria. But that was the hub for British intelligence, totally. And now, of course, now what we're seeing, the British can bring back the Hashemite vision of owning part of Syria also, because that, of course, was thwarted by Syria's independence post-1946 for decades. And who's the first person that Jonathan Powell is a really interesting guy, because I don't know if you all saw former US ambassador Robert Ford, who was actually thrown out of Syria in 2011 because everyone saw that he was inciting the death squads and so on, just as he's done prior to that in Iraq and with Negroponte in Nicaragua, although he'll deny that hotly when I've engaged him on it. But he basically said forward that in 2023, he was invited by a British NGO to come to Idlib to groom Jolani for political challenge. And of course, Jolani had prior to that been groomed up as well by Jonathan Powell in 2021 when he was sort of, had his beard brushed and shoved in a suit and put out on PBS Frontline as the jihadist with political ambitions. And so what this led me to do was to look into this company, which is intermediate, that was started by Jonathan Powell in 2011. Jonathan Powell was chief of staff to Tony Blair when Tony Blair and Bush were setting up the war against Iraq. And of course, this all leads back to the clean break doctrine, because that specified that to secure Israel's security in the region, they had to destabilize all of the countries that might pose a threat in the future. The road to Damascus led through Baghdad, so Iraq had to be completely destroyed. It had to be occupied by American military bases, and broken up into sectarian states, as it was with Kurdistan under the control of the US and so on and so forth. And so Powell was very much the backer of Tony Blair over Iraq. Sorry, the dogs have picked up. Then, of course, just prior to the coup and Damascus falling, Keir Starmer took him on as head of national security, literally weeks before the coup in Syria. And that was after he had been found to write an email to Hillary Clinton back in 2012, where he was basically saying, don't worry about it. I mean, I'm in touch with MI6 and SIS and the Foreign Commonwealth Office. And, we're here to make a bridge between governments and insurgents. And we're starting work in Syria, in Yemen, in Sudan and Somalia. And at that time, of course, Jake Sullivan, who was advisor to Hillary Clinton, was telling her, yeah, Al-Qaeda's on our side in Syria, don't worry. So the connection is there all the way through. And Jonathan Powell is the connecting link, because suddenly here he is as Keir Starmer's national security advisor just before Syria fell. And now he's the first one in, talking to Jolani. His team are basically there grooming the rest of the Al-Qaeda members of his regime, including Shobani, the so-called foreign minister, who, if you remember, had an interview, a very awkward interview with Tony Blair at Davos shortly after the fall of Damascus. So the connection is there all the way through. And this, for me, demonstrates entirely this was a British intelligence operation. The US were there to basically back it up. But Trump's not really interested in Syria. I don't think he really cares one hoot about Syria. He wants to get his troops out. He wants to focus on China. He wants to focus potentially on Iran, but I think Iran's not going to be any sort of conventional aggression. And he wants to leave it to the Brits and Israel. That's basically, I think, how he sees it going. And the French might play a minor role. I mean, they're already trying to get a foothold back in Latakia port and some of the dry ports in Syria, but they don't have the capability to be the force they were under Sykes-Picot.
Phenomenal, really fascinating. Vanessa, thank you. I don't want to take too much time. I want to give Drago and Hartmut a chance to also ask questions.
Yeah, I mean, as Alex said, it's fascinating. It's also sad because we were all supportive of Syria, and I mean, I really don't know how. Even if there is, of course, I'm sure you're going to give us your take on this. But as far as I know, one of the cornerstones of Syria's sovereignty was its air defenses, and now those are gone. So even if there is a political and a military, let's say, resistance movement that takes over all of Syria, I mean, how are they going to defend themselves against potentially Israeli or Turkish aggression, or whoever is interested in making sure that Syria never regains its sovereignty? So, I mean, what are even the chances for these people to, and also there's the issue of international recognition, because now, I mean, before, when Assad was in power, NATO didn't have a legal basis for its intervention in Syria, or I mean, invasion essentially, because that's what it was. But now they will have it. Like, they will say, oh, okay, this is a Syrian government and these people are terrorists. We're going to help them fight the so-called terrorists, who are actually the remnants of the SAA. So, I mean, how can they even defend themselves? And even if Russia supports them, which I really don't know if it's going to happen, but I mean, how are they going to acquire enough air defenses to protect whatever territory they're going to get.
Yes, I agree with you. But I think we've also got to remember that when it comes to on the ground fighting, I mean, Hezbollah prevented any Zionist incursion despite the air force that Israel was using against them and the decimation of infrastructure in southern Lebanon. But Israel didn't advance 1 meter into southern Lebanon until the ceasefire and until the state and the army and UNIFIL took over the control of the territory under the conditions of the ceasefire. And then, of course, what have we seen? We've seen Israeli encroachment onto Lebanese territory way beyond what they achieved when they were fighting Hezbollah. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a military strategist. You're far more in that field than I am. And you're absolutely right. The air defense has been destroyed. Iraq does have air defense, whether that could be brought in to help Syria if we're further down the line, for example. I really don't know. I'm kind of thinking aloud here. As regards Russia, I know from sources that are working on a political movement that at the moment Russia isn't interested. It has to sort out Ukraine. It has to Ukraine and Libya take precedence right now over doing anything else in Syria. And so Syria is really very much on its own as far as being a resistance member is concerned, right? It hasn't got any real political support. Of course, countries like Venezuela are always going to support Syria and the resistance because Venezuela's relationship through Chavez and Maduro with Syria goes way back and is incredibly strong. So they would always support it. But Venezuela doesn't have the international weight that Russia has, for example. It doesn't have veto, it doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. So that support would be relatively low key at the moment.
Yeah, I presume it would be largely symbolic, and I mean it's a shame because as you mentioned, I mean a lot of people are talking about minorities, but as you said, the thing is the vast majority of Syrians, whoever they are, Sunnis or Shia or Alawites or Christians, they were the ones who wanted to live in a normal country, not in this Takfiri monster that NATO created. So, I mean, I'm not even sure like which political power could try to take Syria through, I mean, peaceful means. I mean, through democratic elections. And I mean, since the MI6 is there, I doubt there will be any actual democratic elections or political parties who could do anything.
I think pragmatically speaking, and you know, we have to be pragmatic these days because we don't really have a choice. But I think, and this is by design also, of course, is that right now the Syrian people will accept just about anything that isn't Jolani and isn't HTS. And as I said, that of course is by design. And at some point, I think what they will do is bring in a Syrian from outside, and they'll create a government that is a client state of Washington and London, and of course, by default, Israel. Unfortunately, Syria, I think, will normalize with Israel. I think that's unavoidable. And of course, that also was part of the plan. Syria was always the #1 goal because, of course, it's the central hub, it's the land bridge, it's the backbone of the resistance axis. And not only was it the land bridge, it was manufacturing the majority of the weapons that had been supplied to Palestine and to Lebanon for a very long time, even through the regime change war. And of course, all of those facilities are now either under the control of Jolani's militia, or I think there was actually a Zionist operation a few days ago where they flew a helicopter into an area, Al-Sukna near Homs, They landed, special forces, they grabbed 2 people and they left. We still don't really know what the purpose of that is. But that's the thing, Israel can basically do what it wants in Syria right now. And it can also use Syria to launch attacks against Iraq, for example, against Yemen, Syrian airspace, I mean. But I think what we will see is a client government put in place by the West, which of course is going to normalize with Israel. I think Jelani is either going to be got rid of or he's going to be put to use somewhere else. And it brings me back to an interview that Jelani did back in 2015 in Arabic, where he talks about the fact that he has under his control all of these Sunni Takfiri movements, and that his job is to cut the hands of the resistance of Iran, to cut the hands of Iran in the region, which is the resistance, and then to ignite internal destabilization in Iran using the Takfiri elements from Pakistan, from Balochistan, the Kurds in northwest Iran, right, and even in Azerbaijan and so on, and weaponize those. And he talks about 20 million Takfiri that he can raise as an army, and that was in 2015. So that's why I'm saying that the potential for war against Iran is still there, but it's not going to be a conventional war, because that would be really dumb on behalf of the US and Israel, in my opinion, because the US hasn't even been able to deal with Yemen. I think, 1 billion at the bottom of the Red Sea, basically. And Trump had to kind of pretend that he'd won against the Yemenis when he clearly hadn't. He'd lost a huge amount of hardware, 3 Super Hornets at the bottom of the Red Sea, which I still kind of have to giggle at, especially when you hear the excuses for why they fell off. And he didn't achieve anything. He didn't stop Yemen targeting Ben Gurion Airport. They have no intelligence in Yemen at all. That's also been admitted by Trump, and Trump also admitted that they're making their own weapons. They're doing a really good job. So I think if they stumbled over Yemen, they sure as hell are not going to win a war against Iran without a lot of pain for the region, particularly the Gulf states, who are going to be the first to be targeted, which will destroy the oil revenue, of course, and resources. And then American bases and Israel itself. So a conventional war with Iran, in my opinion, is not even, that's just belligerence and rhetoric from the US and even from Israel, I think, although Israel's more of a lunatic state as far as I'm concerned. But I think the internal destabilization is a very possible reality.
Well, I mean, Jelani was active in Iraq, so if they wanted to do something towards Iraq, I presume that they would push him into Iraq with some other renamed, I presume renamed.
Or even Yemen. They might even send them to Yemen, because they might consider that, well, if we want to get rid of the foreign mercenaries, we can send them into southern Yemen, and from there we can try and weaponize them against Ansarullah. It's northern Yemen, but I mean the southern part is actually relatively small in contrast to the northern part of Yemen that is the resistance. And even southerners now are starting to kind of think, well, we're not sure we want to be on the side of Israel, UAE, and the US, right? So there's potential for the Takfiris being weaponized elsewhere for sure, and that includes Europe. Actually, I kind of forgot about that bit.
Well, I mean, good luck with trying to win a ground war against the Houthis. I mean,
exactly. I'm not worried about that.
Yeah. I mean, if they can defeat the U.S. Navy, I'm not worried about anyone else. So, I mean, I hope it's not going to escalate, but I really don't see any other solution, because they need to destabilize the processes within the multipolar world, especially like any sort of integration processes in the Middle East, So I presume we'll only see more chaos.
Hmm. Silence.
No, maybe it's my turn.
Yeah. Sorry, Carpet.
No problem at all. Concerning the Westworld, it's so interesting as Germany, for example, since December 2024 has invested 300 million in Syria. The European Union 2.5 billion, and the international community, I think, wait a minute, was 5.8. Yeah, 5.8 billion euros, and the European Union 2.5 billion. So there is a lot of cash flow now going on to Syria for
There's a lot of pledging. I'm not sure that a lot of that cash is actually making it into Syria. I think a lot of it has been kind of lip service to the, you know, for the normalization and the legitimization of the Al Qaeda regime, because, you know, people, the public that are aware of what happened in the war against Syria, and I think public consensus has changed dramatically since probably around 2016, with the liberation of Aleppo by the Syrian Arab Army, and basically the collapse of the media narratives to a large degree, and then the collapse of the chemical weapon narratives and so on. You know, Europe, yes, I saw that. I mean, everyone has pledged billions, millions, but I can tell you none of that has actually arrived inside Syria. And I mean, you know, Trump lifting sanctions for 180 days is zero. It's nothing. I mean, that's just a gesture, because 180 days, what businessman is going to come in and invest into industry in Syria on the basis that after 180 days, those sanctions are probably going to be put back on because Giuliani's, I don't know, not fulfilling conditions that Trump's imposing on him. Of course, number one being the normalization with Israel.
Well, do you think that the money didn't come at all? For example, that it goes directly back to the West? Or do you think that the money will be used in a specific way, how Ahmed al-Sharaa wants to use it?
Oh, I don't think he has any say in how that's going to be used at all. I think, for example, the French might use it to, they've just signed a new 30-year contract on Latakia port, or rather, what is it? CGM, the big French shipping company, has just signed a new 30-year contract. It already had a contract even under the former government, but it's investing millions on development and expansion. So that's kind of, I think, where some of this money is going to go. It's going to go into the colonial projects to rebuild Syria. And of course, this is what they do. I mean, Alex, you know this, in former Yugoslavia and any of the NATO war escapes, what do? Destroy, and then they profiteer on the rebuilding, right? And so I think that's honestly where a lot of this money is going to go. But I'm speculating on this. I don't have any documented evidence on it, but certainly the people of Syria aren't seeing any benefit from these pledges from the EU or the UK, nor have they ever since the beginning of the regime change war.
Well, I get suspicious, for example, when there was the revolution in Libya and Muammar al-Gaddafi was killed, a minister arrived who was a prisoner of Guantanamo accidentally. And interesting, Ahmed al-Sharaa was also in the prison of Abu Ghraib, Cambodia, Camp Papa, and the prison of Tachi, which were led by the Americans accidentally. This is also interesting that these people that who were so long in prisons then became leaders.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And also, you know, Giuliani, when he was because he was initially ISIS, then he basically left ISIS to found Nusra Front, which is Al Qaeda in Syria. And then I think when he was kind of tagged as being the potential challenger for political power in Syria, he changed it to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, and he tried to distance himself from the Al Qaeda sort of labeling. And in Idlib, which was maximum between 2 million to 3 million people, he couldn't manage it. The only reason he could manage Idlib is through ethnic cleansing, through imprisonment, execution, corruption, extortion, etc., right? And the only reason he could manage it, again, I've kind of written extensively about this, was bringing certain Takfiri groups under the HTS umbrella, and 40% of those various groups were foreign. So they were from China, the Uyghurs, the Chechens, and so on, Afghanistan, all over the world. And he had detractors even in Idlib. Haras al-Din were one of the groups that were constantly in competition with him. Nur al-Din Zinki, another US-funded organization, the one that beheaded the 12-year-old boy in Aleppo in 2016. But what the US did was to basically assassinate the leaders of these groups to keep Jilani in power. He hasn't got this anymore, right? And Trump, as I said, is now putting on pressure on him to get rid of the foreign terrorists. Well, he can't, because if he gets rid of them, as I said, he's lost 40% of his military force. And he's already put them in prominent positions in the new unelected government. And at the same time, the US is no longer assassinating his detractors. They're no longer interfering. He can't manage a population of whatever it is now, 23 million, with groups within that population, like the Druze, for example, who have effectively refused to surrender their weapons. They don't accept the Jilani government, and they're fighting against him. You've even got, I always forget his name, Ahmed Auda, who in fact, from the Dada 5th Brigade that was formed by Russia when the South was liberated by the Syrian Arab Army and allies. Russia formed, I think it's the 5th Legion of the 8th Brigade, actually, that is basically a conglomeration of all of the Syrian armed groups, led by Ahmed Auda, who was the first to enter Damascus on the day it fell. He was actually the one that entered, not HTS. So this was, again, Russia saying to Turkey, no, like, our guys are going to enter Damascus first, right? And Auda is still a problem for Jilani in the south. So in the south, he has Israel, he has the Druze, and he has al-Auda. In the northeast, he has the Kurds. I mean, the Kurdish agreement really isn't working out. Like, it was never intended to. It was just intended to distract from the massacres on the coast. So that's not working out. He's got the US proxies camps on the borders of eastern Damascus. He's got Turkey in the north that's getting increasingly impatient. And then you've got the Turkish proxies, like the Syrian National Army, which was formerly the Free Syrian Army. So he's really kind of isolated right now. Might not look like that because he is being still bolstered by the West in diplomatic spheres in the UN and so on and so forth. They're still, because they can't sort of turn around and say, yeah, but he's Al-Qaeda, we need to get rid of him, because they supported him for the last 14 years and they put him in power. So they have to give some kind of semblance of you know, I don't know, new generation terrorist to him, I guess.
And how is your opinion about Ahmed al-Sharaa and his connection to Afghanistan? Because one of the first acts he did as a, let's say, as a more or less president, he had a phone call with the foreign minister of Afghanistan. And in my opinion, Afghanistan is also still good under control of the West. And does this have any influence on the people in, does this connection has any influence on the people on the ground in Syria?
He does have, obviously, Afghani Takfiri fighters under his command. But also, I think the Afghanistan connection is also related to Iran the potential of weaponizing the Takfiris against Iran. That would be my reading of that. But he also, because what's interesting is the Ansarullah embassy was closed in Damascus in 2023 when Assad was basically sort of trying to get the Gulf states to invest in Syria and to help him out under the Caesar sanctions, right? Now, Jolani has brought in the Saudi proxy Yemeni government, which of course is not recognized as the government by the huge majority of Yemenis, but he's brought them back to the embassy. So I think, you know, and who's he talking to? I mean, Morocco, Sudan, Somalia. So he's talking to basically the countries that have already normalized with Israel, effectively, right? And who were targeted following the clean break doctrine strategy in '96, and then post 9/11. All of the countries that posed a threat to Israel were targeted, and of course that includes Libya and Iraq, but also Sudan, Somalia. And this, again, was reiterated by Wesley Clark and numerous other officials in successive US administrations, that they were going to basically take out the countries that would threaten Israel's security in the region.
I found it very interesting. I thought I said in the last podcast that Trump made a contract with Saudi Arabia concerning weapons for $147 billion again. And interestingly, I see this kind of contracts as a guarantee that Israel will never be attacked by Saudi Arabia, because of the maintenance costs and all that stuff. So the Americans are have the complete control over the weapons in the Arabic region, and so nothing will. The Arabic states have not the power, also from the military point, to intervene as they want to do it.
Yeah, I found it quite interesting that, I mean, Drago, maybe you can comment on this, but he also mentioned in the deal with Saudi Arabia maritime security, which I found really interesting, because this can only relate to the Strait of Hormuz. So this means protection, because the big danger for the Gulf states, as I mentioned, if a war with Iran were to happen, they would be the first to be targeted, because Iran would target the oil refineries and the oil industry in those Gulf states immediately, right? And so I think the visits by Saudi Arabia to Iran and then Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia was all about also securing their ability to defend themselves against an Iranian air attack or sea attack were it to happen. And so therefore, when he talks about air defense, and I think he also mentions Air Force capability, but the interesting one for me was maritime security. So that is also what's going on, I think. Yes, it's to ensure that not only that Israel is safe, but that these countries have the ability to defend Israel. Because we've seen Saudi Arabia and Jordan bringing down Iranian missiles and Yemeni missiles and drones, right? So it's also as a defense shield, because actually their air defense is failing pretty miserably against relatively rudimentary Yemeni drones and missiles, to be honest. And it's a four-layer defense system. Again, I think, Drago, if you can confirm that. But then if you add in, the countries that those missiles have to pass over, it's actually more than that. And yet it's making its way through, which is
yeah. They have the Iron Dome, which is like for these very low, very short range, these tactical rockets and missiles, and then they have the Arrow, and then also, of course, the exo-atmospheric defense that they also have, which is separated in other subsections. But I think the problem for Israel is they don't have the depth of territory for such a defense. So they need these countries to participate in that in order to be effective. And Syria was
Yeah.
a major, like a gaping hole in that defense. And also, on top of that, attacks were coming at Israel from the Syrian territory, although not in the since the essentially it paused since the start of the NATO aggression. But yeah, I think you're 100% right. They would want to secure Syria to ensure the safety of Israel in the case that Israel decides to launch a nuclear strike against Iran, and then Iran retaliates. But I mean, as you said, this is insane because the Iranians have at least 2,000 ballistic missiles of intermediate range. So, I mean, I'm not sure what sort of warheads they can put on these. I mean, apart from the conventional ones, whether they will be chemical or nuclear, whatever. Israel is populated in a way that any sort of war would be suicidal because most of the Israeli population lives in the coastal regions. They're tightly packed. You wouldn't even need a lot of missiles to obliterate all that. So for them, the best thing would be to establish some sort of peace. But it seems they're doing the exact opposite and thinking if they conquer all these countries and control them, that they can defend themselves. But I'm not sure how that's going to work.
No, and I was just thinking kind of again then, what would be quite interesting, of course, is if the British take control of the military and then they think it's absolutely safe to establish air defense in Syria, to use Syria as another zone of defense or another layer of defense for Israel. And then in the future, the resistance retake Syria, but I'm kind of like living maybe in fantasy land there, but you never know.
Well, that would be a sort of poetic justice, I guess. But I mean, I'm not even sure like who would finance that because the Soviet Union like spent 40 years building Syrian air defenses, and those were like very serious air defenses, like the S-200, which depending on the variant can have a range of up to 300 kilometers. And can also be like reprogrammed into essentially being ballistic missiles that you can use against ground targets, which the Syrians were doing actually at some point. Because these are like gigantic missiles, like with 6,000 or 7,000 tungsten cluster warheads, essentially. So it's enormous, and it's a hugely powerful because it can bring down, let's say, a formation of fighter jets or even bombers. But I mean, I don't see the point is like Western countries and Israel haven't really invested that much into that kind of air defense. They invested a lot in missile defense. That's something that they might install in Syria, now occupied Syria, unfortunately. But I don't see how air defenses would be. I mean, they don't even use air defenses because they've never been in a situation where they don't have air superiority. So it's mostly going to be missile defenses.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah. Unless, of course, it escalates between Turkey and Israel. That could be the only other.
Yeah, that would be the most interesting thing. I don't know how Azerbaijan is going to react to that. Because they have good
his
relations.
People wouldn't. Yeah, and his population wouldn't be too happy either because, you know, they kind of put up with his interference in Syria on the basis that it would bring huge economic rewards that are just not happening right now. But, you know, nothing. Yeah. He's just pouring money into Syria, and he's not really getting anything back out of it.
Yeah, the Turks are pretty pissed because, I mean, they've been living in this pitiful economic situation for around a decade or so, and there's no end in sight at all, and it's only going to get worse, especially with the situation with the high inflation, which has been ongoing for like 5 or 6 years, if I'm not mistaken. So I really don't. I mean, he doesn't have the hard core. I mean, the hard currency needed to, you know, rebuild whatever he wants to rebuild in Syria, and I mean, I really don't know how that's going to work because the Chinese, who are far richer and have far more means to rebuild something, are not, you know, running to do that, are not really in a hurry to do that. But and Turkey has even less resources for something like that.
And also they have now, I mean, people exaggerate the numbers, but there are a large number of Takfiri elements now in Turkey, I mean, there was something like 5 million refugees from Syria who, as far as I know, have not all gone back. A very small percentage of them have gone back and are starting to go back. But there is a very big extremist element inside Turkey itself, which at any moment could be triggered. So he's,
Well,
I mean, he's created.
Well, he created the issues for himself, and even if it's like 1% of that entire population, that's still like an army that you have to fight. And I mean,
exactly.
It's a nightmare to fight a war like that.
Mm.
And I want to mention that, for example, hyperinflation or inflation is a military weapon. So Turkey is, since they have this inflation, it's under attack. Yeah, and this is a fight which you only can lose. In that case, you have an own currency.
Mm.
Vanessa, a question. Did you say that the MI6 central in Turkey was Antakya? Is that?
No, Gaziantep.
Oh, Gaziantep.
Gaziantep. Yeah, which is, if you look, it's right on the border with Syria. So it's southern Turkey.
Okay, thank you. And
no worries.
Before we let you go, what do you reckon is the state of Hezbollah at this time?
I certainly wouldn't be writing them off, as many people in Western media are doing. They have, what they've basically done, which I think was the most intelligent thing that they could do. Many people criticized the ceasefire back in November, and of course, within hours of the ceasefire being put in place, the attack on Syria began. And I remember at the time thinking, why is Netanyahu agreeing to this right now? It just seemed to go through way too quickly, And then, of course, it became very apparent why he went ahead with it, because then he could pivot to Syria. And so basically, Hezbollah lost many fighters. They lost Sayed Hassan Nasrallah, they lost Safiuddin, they lost multiple leaders. They had the pager attacks. And they lost many martyrs in the battles against Israel on the border. As I said, Israel didn't advance 1 meter into Lebanese territory, trying to break through the Hezbollah defenses. So Hezbollah took what was really the only decision they could take, which was to withdraw and regroup. Obviously, after Syria fell, to some degree, they lost, as I said, the land bridge, they lost the weapons supply. But at the same time, what people tell me here is that, thank God, Syria endured the regime change war for 14 years, because what that did was to give Hezbollah the capability to build their own weapons, to develop their own technology centers far underground, and to prepare for the potential of Syria going under, because, they had to think about all possibilities. So those 14 years gave them time to really prepare for the worst, and they did. And now what they've done is to step back, also to prevent the civil war that, of course, Israel and the West would love to have in Lebanon, because that would keep Hezbollah busy fighting their own people inside Lebanon. And so they didn't want that to happen. And Israel was starting to bomb closer and closer into central Beirut. Not only in the Hezbollah areas, they were starting to target other areas, particularly the Lebanese forces, which of course traditionally and historically have been anti-Hezbollah and anti-resistance and pro-Zionist. They were the ones, the phalange that led the massacre against Palestinians in Sabra and Shatila and so on. So to avoid civil war, but also to really let people see what happens when the state and the army take over, to what extent is Lebanon not going to be protected? And that has been made absolutely 100% clear, because Israel is bombing every single day. It's evacuating schools in Dahe, in the southern Beirut suburbs, and bombing. It's bombing in the Bekaa in the northeast. There are drones overhead the whole time. It's basically carrying out business as normal. It's encroaching on Lebanese territory. It's remained on the 5 high points in the south from where it can carry out attacks and surveillance of the resistance. And it's continuing to do so. And of course, in Syria also, it's taken control of Mount Hermon, which is another one of the highest points that overlooks all of Lebanon and all of Syria. And so basically Hezbollah has sat back and said, okay, let's see what the new government and the army can do, and UNIFIL. And of course, they're doing nothing. Like, UNIFIL is known to be an agent of Israel anyway. The army is doing nothing other than putting reports into the government, who then has to put reports into the UN. And of course, nothing's going to be done. So people here are starting to understand that if we don't have resistance, we've got absolutely no defense against Israel. And we know from history,
that if they removed Hezbollah, I think that the Lebanese government would be something like Palestinian Authority. Yeah,
very much. No, Israel would invade. I mean, it's already talked about the territory in the south being Israeli. It has laid claim to that historically, and it tried in 1982, of course, to invade up as far as Beirut. So people know that without Hezbollah, and of course the British and the Americans are pushing, all of the IMF loans are dependent upon Hezbollah's disarmament. Again, the kind of economic hitmen are coming in now. Like, you want us to rebuild? And Saudi and Qatar are the same. We're not going to rebuild. We're not going to give you any money until Hezbollah agrees to disarm. So it's a very difficult situation, but Israel again is pushing the envelope. And I think the resistance rhetoric has become a little bit more testy in the last few days. And most people here feel that we're heading back into conflict fairly soon. We'll see. We'll have to see. But I mean, they can't keep absorbing it. That's the point. Yeah. And the people are with them now. The majority of people, except for the factions, of course, that are totally pro-Israel, like you said, exactly like Fatah and PA. But the majority, many of my Christian friends here, Lebanon is a lot more sectarian than Syria, are now understanding that without Hezbollah, they have no defense. Not only no defense against Israel, also no defense against HTS, because HTS is encroaching also on Lebanese territory and is threatening Lebanese territory. So the people themselves now know fully that without Hezbollah, they're not going to be properly defended against either of the two possible threats to the country.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. That's wonderful to hear. So is that what gives you hope in this battle?
What gives me hope? I don't know. Some days it's very hard to keep it, to be honest. The resistance is extraordinary. It's an ideology. It's something that's ingrained in the DNA. And I think while that exists, we don't really have the option to opt out or give up or say, what's the point? Because while there is still a resistance, then I think we just have to keep going.
Well, Vanessa, please invite our audience where they can follow and support you, or how they can support you.
Oh, that's really kind. I mean, mostly on Substack these days, Telegram. Yeah, Substack and Telegram, those are the two main ones.
Yeah, the Billy.substack or Vanessa Billy Substack, and that's in Telegram too, is Vanessa Billy. And of course, she has the patreon.com/Vanessa Beeley. Okay.
Thank you. I forget most of them. I'm hopeless at PR.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, you can graciously exit if you had to. Alex, you want to?
No, I thank you to everyone. I always enjoy these conversations. They're always, just so relaxed and interesting questions. And it's nice to be able to take all of your opinions also, because that's what is important, because everyone has different perspectives and different input, and it's really important for us to not be isolated and to actually share those opinions more often. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
Take care.
Take care. Alex, invite the people if you want to. Where are they?
All right. Yes. So I'm active on Substack. 2 publications. One is daily market newsletter called iSystem Trend Following. The other one is my personal Substack called Alex Krainer's Substack. And then I'm active on X. Handle is @NakedHedgie. That's that.
And Drago?
Yeah, I still write for the info breaks. I'm also, as of recently, I'm a research associate at the Center for Research on Globalization. I work with Professor Chosudovsky, who, of course, I'm sure most of your viewers know. We're still trying to get him to come on the show. He's a bit busy, but I think we're going to succeed in that. And that's pretty much where you can find my work.
And I want him to come because, he's adding more years in his life. Okay?
Yeah, I know.
I don't want it to shorten that, but I want to seize that opportunity. You never know.
Yeah. Hopefully he's going to be free very soon.
Hartmut?
Well, I'm work as an international intermediary, and also started doing Christian coaching. So I'm reading Thomas of Aquinas, and which is a work of the 1265, and take this knowledge in Christian motivation so that the people get a sense of manipulation. Because we have to understand today that the social media has many similarities to psychological torture.
Yeah, I agree with that. Definitely.
And feel free to get in touch with me at Grace Asagra @ymail, or just you can find me. Okay. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to our audience. And please do your thing. Okay. We all can do something, and positively. Don't lose hope. Take care, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. To all.
Bye, guys.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.